I'm Peggy Dellinger, a trustee and co-founder of the Ocean Township Historical Museum, and I'm sitting in today on Hometown Histories with our guest, Kay Harris. Kay is a friend. I think we met for the first time when I was doing an exhibit on Asbury Park, and you were generous in your memories and your memorabilia, and we're going to tap some of that today. We've invited Kay to be on Hometown Histories because she represents a very rich history of the City of Asbury Park. And Asbury Park was once part of Ocean Township. And in this, our 170th anniversary year as a township, we're highlighting the communities that were once part of Ocean Township. So welcome, Kay. It's so nice to see you and have you here.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Always a pleasure.
And I just really want to compliment you on the great job you did on your exhibit of Asbury Park. And I learned so much by visiting the museum because I was not aware at that time that Asbury Park was a part of Ocean
Township. Right. We're trying to rectify that. It's part of what we're doing here today. But thank you. And as I said, you and many others were invaluable resources for that exhibit. So today we're going to talk about the history of Asbury Park, but we're going to hone in especially on the west side of Asbury Park, which was your stomping ground and where you grew up, right? So for our viewers, let's start by talking about, in a general way, the west side. Let's put it on the map and give them a little bit of context for what they're going to hear from you.
Okay, absolutely. So the west side of Asbury Park would be, of course, almost every community has what they call the west side of the tracks.
Right.
So ours was west of the railroad tracks, west of Memorial Drive, and also the southern end of Asbury Park. So it's the southwest quadrant. And the main thoroughfare was Springwood Avenue.
That was east-west.
Yes. Yeah, it does run east and west. And then, of course, you have the different, the neighborhoods that branched off from Springwood Avenue. But that was the center of activity where we had businesses, retail stores, your corner stores, venues for clubs and entertainment.
Right.
In fact, there's a rich history in terms of the musical history as well.
Right, we'll get into that for sure, because that's a personal favorite of mine too. But let's contrast the west side with the east side, so that we get a sense of what's so special about what we're going to talk about.
Okay. Well, everyone is aware, in general, that Bradley founded Asbury Park itself, like in 1871, and he was very methodical in the way he designed the town, with the streets very wide. And but the west side was actually acquired by a different person, Reardon, and it was in 1888, and it annexed and became a part of Asbury Park in 1906. But when that property or acreage was purchased, it was really for the purposes of providing the laborers needed to build Asbury Park.
Right.
So it was a combination of your Italians, your Germans, African Americans. It was a very
Jewish
diverse Jewish community.
Right, many of the merchants on the east side. Right.
Yes.
So purchasing that property gave a place for those laborers whose talents and sweat equity were building the trolley lines and the hotels and the houses and the public spaces and all those things. And let's just talk for one short minute about Bradley's vision. When he purchased those 500 acres, having visited Ocean Grove and thought that Methodist community was just the cat's meow, he thought, I'm going to do this. I'm going to kind of create an Ocean Grove light. We're not going to have any liquor.
Right.
We're not going to have any unseemly pastimes. So he laid that out to be a resort community, right, for the people coming down from the city. I think the rail line was extended to Asbury in 1875 or so, close enough to the founding that it really brought the population he was looking for. But it was very white. It was very upper class, kind of, right? Because it was the people who could afford to come, stay for the summer. And it was very Methodist. It was very dry, right?
Absolutely.
And he wanted no unseemly entertainment on the boardwalk, not even too loud.
Right.
never mind gambling or anything as unseemly as that. Leave that to Long Branch, right? So as the workers from the who built the east side began to live on the west side, my understanding is that the mayor, Hendrick, who was looking for Asbury to give up its dry laws, give up its prohibition, decided that if he were to annex the west side, he would have a built-in constituency to overturn these dry laws, right?
Exactly.
So that's kind of
and then it gave the visitors, people who did frequent Asbury Park, another destination. Oh, okay, now we can go hang out in Springwood Avenue to the clubs there.
Right, because the west side brought such ethnic, cultural, musical, culinary richness to that kind of white bread on the east side. Right. Yeah. Okay,
I think they wanted to have it both ways, actually.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think you're right. And to some extent that was true, right?
Yes,
To some extent, well, you're going to tell us all about that.
There was a pull and the tug and everything. But at the same time, as the folks from the west side wanted to come and enjoy what was available on the east side, there was like a barrier to that. So my understanding is that the business owners said that their customers felt very uncomfortable having blacks hanging out on the boardwalk, and they took a very strong stance on that. And eventually, over time, then blacks were not. I think at one point they were restricted to certain hours, and then eventually they said they were just not allowed on the boardwalk or at the beach at all. And then they were delegated to that one section of the beach between Asbury and Ocean Grove, where the sewage, comes out. And in fact, they would have signs in current years that says danger. You're not even allowed to swim there. But that's where
you were. Right, where the African Americans were giving. I know, seems unfathomable, right? But it's not. Yeah. It's not within your lifetime.
Not really, but the aftermath of it was because that's where we were forced to go. Instead, most of us, we actually went to Belmar.
Oh, I see.
So traditionally, all my life, that's what the beach that I grew up going and enjoying.
Because that became the custom.
I never actually went to Asbury Park Beach until I was an adult. So traditionally, Belmar Beach was where we hung.
I didn't know that. That's fascinating. Okay, so
we did go to the boardwalk as I was growing up as a child, to enjoy the amusements.
Right.
But in terms of the amusements, my father did not have that same opportunity because it was segregated for him.
Right.
And it was like the Jim Crow.
I'm going to ask you a personal question.
Okay.
And I know you're going to answer it because you've answered it for our newsletter.
Okay.
Tell us when you were born.
Okay.
And what your childhood was like, where you lived, and what it was like to grow up on the west side.
Okay. I was born in 1952, class of 1970 at Asbury Park High School. So I went to Bangs Avenue Elementary School. And even though the history of the west side, even though I said it was a very mixed neighborhood, and I've even heard people even recently saying, what are they talking about Asbury Park? We've always lived together and gotten along. But people forget the fact that even on the west side, even though it was a mixed neighborhood, Bangs Avenue School was segregated. It was actually a Bangs North and a Bangs South.
On the same campus?
Yes.
Separate buildings?
Locations. Right. They were, almost interconnected, but they were right next to each other. So it was about 1943 when a group of citizens protested, and I know my grandparents were part of that, to say that we needed the schools to be desegregated. And that fall, they were successful, and the school was finally integrated. But once they integrated the school, there was this pushback, and then the parents of Bangs North, where the white students went to, they said, well, instead of that, we want you to separate the boys and girls, and we can have the girls go to Bangs North and the boys go to Bangs South.
But racially integrated.
Yes, that was their compromise. However, that was not accepted by the board. They resisted. Matter of fact, in addition to them separating it by sex, then they said they wanted all the students to be tested for venereal diseases.
Oh, my God.
And this is a grammar school. And of course, that's completely abhorrent because nothing like that was done.
Ever done in a
They
white
didn't even
school.
do it in the high school.
Right.
Okay, so all that was dismissed completely, and we were successful in integrating the school. And then as a result, the family just gradually started pulling their children out of Bangs Avenue School and sending them to Mount Carmel. My understanding
The
is
white
that
families.
the white families. Typically, I think it was the girls first, and then gradually, they pretty much pulled them all out. So when I attended Bangs Avenue School, it was an all-black school for the most part.
Yeah.
And then, so I grew up on Sylvan Avenue, which is a cross street to Springwood Avenue. So I lived on Sylvan until about the age of about 8. And then we moved to Bangs Avenue. But even on Sylvan Avenue, I just remember it was a great neighborhood. My grandmother owned the house, and we lived on the second and third floor over her. And she was a very feisty woman and very well known in the community. She was very outspoken, and they had the Better Block Club, and she was into her gardening, and of course she was a big person in terms of civil rights. That's a whole nother
We'll talk about that.
later.
Yeah, right.
But I just have a lot of fond memories, growing
Of
up.
what were you doing as a kid? I mean, what was it like?
The basic things, playing jacks and pick up sticks and jump rope. And then we had, huge backyard. We'd play, was it softball, football, whatever season it was. And I had a backyard with the sandbox and the swings and playing in the mud pies. I remember all those things as a young kid. So just a typical.
It is typical. It is just kind of charming, I guess, is the word. I don't know. And it's so similar to mine, although I grew up in New England, right?
Mm-hmm.
In a little New England village that was so different, playing jacks and having all that same stuff,
Yeah,
right?
kids don't tend to go outside and play now. They have play dates, though, right?
Right.
But we would just, they would open the door, you go out and play, then you come back when it's time to eat.
So you moved from Sylvan to
Bangs Avenue, between Comstock and Langford. So it's just a few blocks away. That particular neighborhood was, in fact, the reason why we did move is because the city was taking over the street, eminent domain.
Oh, yeah?
And they wanted to tear down these lovely houses to build.
Oh, that happened?
Yes. They
to build what?
Like the Vita Garden, Stephen Manor.
Oh, okay.
So anyway, so we moved to Bangs Avenue. And that particular street, it was mixed because we had Burdine's funeral home was one end, Dr. Robinson, who's a dentist. My father's office was connected to the house.
Tell us who your father was.
Oh, Dr. Lorenzo Harris.
So he's a medical doctor.
He was a medical doctor. Mm-hmm.
And he served the community, and his office was in your home?
Yes, it was attached to the home. Back in those days, it was not uncommon for the doctor's offices to be attached to the home.
Sure.
And then, he also did house calls.
Yeah, a lost art, right?
Yes. Now, if you call a doctor, it's please hang up if it's an emergency. Dial 911. Right. So anyway, but I did have a lot of fond memories, and again, playing out, with the neighbors.
Right. And you were playing. Your play groups were integrated?
Yes, they were integrated to some extent. But the interesting thing is, when I look back, I didn't think about it much before, but when I look back, even though we played and we went over each other's houses, but the family that was white on our block, I remember we were never really allowed inside their house.
Yeah.
But, so there's these little subtle things.
Right. And it was the way it was, right? It was the way it was.
Yes.
So you mentioned that you went to Asbury High School.
Yes.
Tell us about what Asbury was like. And you said you graduated in 1970?
Yes. So in terms of Asbury Park, we had 3 grammar schools.
Mm-hmm.
So Bangs Avenue, being on the west side, was predominantly black. Bradley was mixed white and black. And then we had Bond Street, which is now Thurgood Marshall, was predominantly white, but probably some blacks there too. But we also had the sending districts from Inner Lake and Allenhurst. They were coming from Belmar, Bradley Beach. So when you get to the high school level, it was predominantly white, or maybe 60-40
In 19 in the 4 years you were there.
Yes, in the 4 years that I was there.
Because one of those sending districts had been Ocean Township.
Yes, so before Ocean Township acquired its own high school, it was definitely predominantly, white. But they also had a split session situation because it was so overpopulated. But once they pulled out, it did change the proportion. However, so maybe even 50.
Right. I believe we also did an exhibit on the 50th anniversary of Ocean Township High School.
Okay.
And I believe that I remember that there were more students from Ocean Township than from Asbury in 1965. I believe that's the year that Ocean opened. So it would have really taken a significant chunk of the student body out of the school. I think so Ocean leaves, takes with it a mass that changes the racial balance, and then you see a repeat of your Bangs Avenue phenomenon, right?
Yes, so gradually even the sending districts started to try to resist sending their children to Asbury Park. And then they really didn't have a choice, because I'm not sure if it was a lottery system, but they were basically told whether your child would go to Manasquan or Asbury.
I gotcha. Mm-hmm.
And then if they were forced to go to Asbury, maybe instead they would send their child maybe to a private, to a Catholic school, like St. Rose, which is in the area. So again, gradually it started to shift, and I believe it even accelerated over time. And then that's what happens. And then the more people pull out, then the more others are more anxious to also pull their children out. To this extent, today it's
and that begins
like 95%, mixed. And when I say African Americans, Hispanics, Haitians, but non-white students.
Right. Exactly. So when you were in there, in the high school, the split session had ended, right? Because Ocean kids were gone.
Yes.
Right.
It was mixed, and I can say that our class was very, very close. I have a lot of fond memories. We had the student plays, and everybody intermingled, and we got along fine.
And it was still an athletic powerhouse, right?
Oh, yes.
And an academic powerhouse, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Right. And you when you say you're close, do you remain close with your class?
Yeah, in fact, every 10 years we have our class reunion.
Right.
At least I can say that. And then our class is 70, and we always contribute to scholarship funds for the
Right. So you're supporting the high school to today, which is really just a noble thing to do. Mm-hmm. Really great. So we've talked about the phenomenon of the high school and how it affected the residents of the town in terms of both the sending districts and within the city, right? Mm-hmm. So
and even then, I don't mean to interrupt you.
Please do.
It's as much as we got along, and you asked, do we still keep in touch? But because we tended to live in different places in terms of socializing after school, we didn't intermingle to that extent
as much, right? Probably do much more now, right? As you're doing your that color line is gone now as you're celebrating your reunions and such.
Yes,
right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So you see people because of the high school situation. Either moving or reluctant to send their children to the school. It affects the sale of the real estate, that affects the tax base, and it begins to erode the vitality of the city. Mm-hmm. What other phenomenon in your opinion, having lived it and seen it, affected that dark period from maybe the 80s and the 90s through the early...
I believe it really started at the point where the businesses started to move into the suburbs and into the malls.
The malls,
so you had Steinbach's, which was a staple of the downtown business district. We had the phone company. We had the Asbury Park Press, and they started moving out into the suburbs. And even families, a lot of the middle class families started moving. And when I say suburbs, it could be Neptune, Ocean Township.
Right.
So even though we did have the riots in 1970, and a lot of people feel that the riots are responsible for the shift in Asbury Park, but I don't believe that to be the case. I think that was it's an event that occurred in Asbury, just as it occurred in a lot of places around the country. But I think it was the economics of the businesses that moved out because of the malls. We didn't have shopping malls back then.
Right. And Asbury wasn't alone in that pattern. I mean, the 60s, 70s was a time when many people were leaving the cities in our state and elsewhere, and moving into this suburban phenomenon.
And then also in terms of the beachfront, I think that, of course, at one point it was like maybe one of the more popular resorts or destinations,
definitely,
along with maybe Atlantic City and Long Branch. And then, of course, now you have the Parkway and the Turnpike. People can drive further distances. Now they can fly to Florida.
Disney World.
Fly to Disney World, to the islands. So people are able to travel further distances.
Exactly. Some of those factors that pre-air conditioning, pre-air flight.
Right.
Asbury was the obvious place to come, or the desirable.
And then you have other shore communities too, like Point Pleasant, Seaside Heights,
competing. So
over time, or if you think in terms of on a year-round basis, even if you're reliant on just amusements, they're not really generating revenues in the off season.
And from the beginning, Asbury was Bradley was brilliant in this sense that he not only developed a resort town, he created a very thriving and vital retail center. So he did have you had a year-round reason to go to Asbury, right? So when the retail and merchants began to withdraw, you lost that reason to go to Asbury, and again,
and then that impacts the tax base too.
Exactly.
You're
exactly. I remember from the exhibit that in 1962 there were 557 retail establishments in Asbury Park, right? Wow. And I think if we talk about the revitalization, the rebirth, the Renaissance, you see the same thing happening that was part of Bradley's vision, not the dry part, but the part where you're not just developing a resort, you're developing a thriving downtown in the same mold. Because as I remember Asbury back in the day, they were owner-operated shops.
Yes.
You know, and Asbury has managed to come alive again without inviting in the Gap and Sonoma Williams. And, you know what I mean?
Yes.
You have owner-operated restaurants. You have the flavor of the ethnicity of the music scene and the restaurant scene, the bar scene, and so it just it tickles my fancy that it's coming back, and it's coming back reinvented, but in the spirit of the original.
Yes, and it's just taken so long because there was a period of time when we knew that Asbury Park was going to turn around, but it was difficult to determine, okay, when's it going to happen? You know, so there were people who invested, you know, maybe bought properties, they tried to open up a business, and there was such a turnover, though, because people might have tried to open up a business in the 80s and the 90s, and then they continued to struggle.
A major waterfront renovation or revitalization that failed, right?
Yes, in fact, that was a huge part of it too, because then that
got caught up in the two courts and prevented it from coming through.
Right.
Tell me, you mentioned your feisty grandmother, and you mentioned your physician father. The Harris family name is legendary. Certainly in Asbury Park, but beyond. No, beyond. I believe beyond. And it is worthy of an interview show all by itself. And we can't let you go without at least telling us a bit about the colorful history and the remarkable, distinguished history of your grandfather, your grandmother, your father, and your mother, if you wouldn't mind just sharing some of that.
Well, my grandfather is widely known as being a sand sculptor. And he attended a university in Pennsylvania for art, and he had a full 4-year scholarship. And he originally did sand sculptures in the Atlantic City area, and but over time, and not just him, I'm sure there were other sand artists as well, but people used to continue to try to destroy their work. So eventually he decided to come to Asbury Park. So he found a spot and he did sand sculptures, and that was 1916 till the mid-1940s.
Let me just interrupt you for a second, because I want our viewers to know that these aren't castles that kids are building in the sand. Just give a little description of what a sand.
Elaborate sand sculptures, like Cleopatra's Nile wedding. There's a fairy tale scene. Very elaborate.
Just mind-boggling, really. More than elaborate. They're just beyond.
And people used to come from all over to enjoy and take in his artwork, right. And they would throw coins. And then eventually he even patented a device where it has nails on it, and you put the coins in.
Oh, so it would kind of go like
go down, and when you get to the bottom, it would tell you your fortune.
Oh, he was so clever.
And,
just such a talent.
And then he also, if you would come by, he would also do sketches of individuals, and he would title it something, whatever the individual was. He would do sketches.
So he had encountered some racial bias and vandalism based on that in Atlantic City. So what did he do to avoid that when he came to Asbury?
He used to wear like a fez and a robe, so people wouldn't quite know exactly what he was. And in my mind, I think that people probably did, but at least they could pretend that they didn't know what he was.
So they didn't have to confront the race.
Yes.
They didn't confront the racial.
He was actually very active in the community in terms of, racial issues or human rights issues. He and my grandmother were the founders of the Asbury Park Neptune NAACP. He did a lot of publications on Negro history. He was an illustrator for the NAACP Crises magazine, and he was a close friend of W.E. Du Bois.
Amazing.
And matter of fact, I did come across some correspondence where they would write back and forth, and Lorenzo, I'm planning on coming to Asbury Park this weekend. Can we stay with you?
Yeah. Nice.
And I was like, oh, wow. I thought that was exciting to read. And he had also invited W. Du Bois to come speak at Bangs Avenue School, which he did.
And so they lived in a city where African Americans were not welcomed on the boardwalk or on the beach. Did he have a role in changing that? Your grandmother?
Yeah, there were a number of stories. He had passed in 1946, which was before I was born. So most of the stories I've heard from my grandmother, where they went to the theater. I think it was the Savoy Theater, and to go sit down, and then they were told that they had to go sit in the balcony instead. And of course, he resisted and fought back on that. Would go to restaurants and not be served, and so he would bring in some friends who were Caucasian, and you could see that they would get served ahead of him. And he would always fight back on these kinds of situations. I remember my grandmother said they put my dad on the merry-go-round, and, he was
defying the norm.
Yes. And I know I've seen articles where they were protesting in front of different places, because they wanted to speak on Negro history, and then they were prevented from speaking, so they protested. So,
right. And you did mention his role at Bangs Avenue, right? And I think perhaps even beyond Bangs Avenue, he and your grandmother were instrumental in integrating schools in the area, right?
Yes. Well, that was really, the focus, because the others were already integrated.
I think I read somewhere that they were instrumental in integrating Red Bank schools. Did you?
Oh, okay. No, I was not aware of that.
Oh, really? Well, let me tell you. Let me go home and check that fact before you.
Because they were part of a wide group.
Right.
And he was also the group that initially founded the West Side Community Center as well. Right. And he was the first president of the West Side Community Center.
Right. So these were distinguished, intelligent, talented, creative, courageous people who changed the course of events in Asbury Park.
And also my grandfather ran for city council.
Oh, right.
He was not successful, but I thought it was interesting.
But there was justice, right?
Yeah,
right.
My father ran
years
later, and he did and he served 12 years as the first African American city council person.
Right.
And then my sister was also on city council.
Oh, I didn't know
Yes,
that.
Sharon,
Right.
she's my older
Following your
sister.
father? Or they weren't simultaneous.
Not immediately. It was several years later.
Right. So that Harris name probably still carries weight on a ballot, right?
Yeah. But my father was, he was so passionate about Asbury Park and the community. He was a board member of the Boys and Girls Club for about 30 years.
Right. I think you told me a story about what he did when the riots were going on in Asbury that kind of gives a little bit of a window into the kind of man he was. Could you share that with us?
He set up a free clinic, in fact, at the Westside Community Center following the riots. And he also pulled together a number of people in the community after the riots so that they can discuss the issues and see how we can move forward.
Right.
So, he was always active in
So you went through
issues.
You went through life as Dr. Lorenzo Harris Jr.'s daughter, right?
Yeah, I guess, if you're out with your friends and you're at somebody's house, this is Dr. Harris's daughter.
Right.
So,
but he was a wonderful dad as well, right?
Oh,
so
yeah.
that wasn't something that
yeah,
you
but when you live in
resisted.
a community, you're associated with.
Well, you have to behave yourself, right? Right,
Yeah.
but you've done a very good job of behaving yourself, at least as far as I know, Ken.
Well, that wasn't difficult. That wasn't a
It wasn't difficult.
Yeah.
But I just want to point out that you too have lived up to the very high standard set by your grandparents and by your parents, and that you are continuing to do remarkable things for the city of Asbury Park. I just wanted to ask you to share with us your vision for the museum, for example.
Okay, thank you. So I pulled together a group of people to create a museum for Asbury Park, which is way overdue. And I thank you so much for your contributions. Even before I set it up, you said, "Kay, if you ever need anything, we're there to help you."
Yeah.
So we really appreciate that. And the purpose of creating this museum was to showcase the diversity of Asbury Park and the contributions for all of Asbury. There's so much focus on the waterfront, especially these days, as Asbury Park is being revitalized and moving forward. And most of our visitors just come to the boardwalk area. And I've actually been a business owner myself, the Asbury Galleria on the boardwalk. But even when I started it in 2005, after retiring from I created the business while I was still employed with AT&T, and then in 2009 is when I retired from AT&T. It was the same time we were able to. They wanted the business to be open year round.
Right.
So prior to that, it was just seasonal.
Right.
But the whole focus, I wanted to also draw attention to the businesses on Cookman Avenue.
Right.
So as people visited, I didn't want them to just stop at the boardwalk.
Right.
So I wanted to share that.
And we had alluded to the rich music scene in the 20s, 30s, 40s, even into the 50s on the West Side. We never got to that.
Exactly.
But your museum wants to highlight that as well.
So many people associate Asbury Park with Bruce Springsteen.
And the Stone Pony.
And the Stone Pony. But I wanted them to be aware that we're about more than just that genre, and that we do have a rich history.
Right. Duke Ellington, Count Basie, so many, the top names in the jazz world were frequenting
the Moments and Trent. Like individuals who actually grew up in this area, in addition to the national names.
So tell me, I know you have this vision for the museum, and you haven't found permanent digs yet, but you did have a success story, right?
We did. So we were able to get a temporary location this winter from December to March. So Madison Marquette was nice enough to provide us with the location. And so that really was a great opportunity because it gave us exposures, an opportunity to introduce ourselves to the community. It was well attended. We had hundreds of visitors every weekend. And then every weekend we had different programs. We had book authors. We had one fundraiser which was a tribute to Nat King Cole,
Oh,
because it was his 100th
birthday. Yeah.
And so we had a trio performing. And in March, because it was the anniversary of the from the Selma March,
Yes.
I had
To
Reverend
Montgomery.
Caldwell to do a speak from Selma to Montgomery and beyond. And because it was Women's History Month, I also did a little presentation on the women of the civil rights
Right.
movement. So we tried to mix it with programming. Oh, and we also had African American readings for the month of February. But the museum itself showcases a timeline of the history of Asbury Park from its founding in 1871 to the current time. And it showcases the different sections, all of Asbury Park. Then we also have local legends of Asbury Park, which Tom Chesick has created that section for us. And then Charlie and Pam Horner have a really great section that they curated on identifying or showcasing the musical contributions of the West Side.
Right. So now that has that temporary location is no longer available to you. So you're on a quest.
Yes, we are on a definite quest to try to find a permanent home for it. And eventually, at this particular location, we had about 1,400 square feet, but we're envisioning something even larger, maybe around 2,000 square feet, and it'll be interactive. And what we're working on now is just creating some temporary portable displays so that we can have exhibits at different
Can have a
locations.
presence, right?
And actually, the high school, Asbury Park High School, has invited us to set up an exhibit in their media center. So we're, working towards
That's wonderful. Well, you certainly live up to your name, Miss Harris.
Thank you.
And I just want to point out that you mentioned authors. You are one yourself. So just tell us a little bit, show your book. And
From Amistad to the White House, Teachable Moments from 1839 to Within My Lifetime. And I was asked to do a photojournal assignment through the landmark civil rights sites of the South, and I did this for a travel magazine for women of color. And on this journey, I captured the images of events that occurred in history, including the Lorraine Hotel, the Memphis, Tennessee, the 16th Street Baptist Church, Money, Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi. Went to Selma. From Selma across the Edmund Pettus Bridge to Montgomery and to Atlanta. So, and this was also capturing my personal feelings as I went through this journey. And when I did it, initially it was just for the magazine, and then I did some PowerPoint presentations, and I had people say, "Oh, why don't you do a book?" So eventually I started expounding on it into a book. And as I started to wind down with the book, we started entering the phase of the elections of 2008. And so anyway, the book actually continues beyond that through the election of 2016. Because initially I was writing the book from the perspective of, wow, how our nation has changed to have elected the first African-American president. But then after that, things started to change. The curtains were kind of pulled back with this new president. In fact, even before he became president, during the whole election, lead up to the actual election. And there's so many events that took place. So this captures Black Lives Matter, Trayvon Martin. It captures Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, and all of the different incidences. And then the shooting in North Carolina at the church, to show how there's still so much work. And there's an undercurrent that needed to still be discussed. So hopefully this is an opportunity to say, wow, well, what is happening to our nation? Let's have some dialogue on both sides. Let's go back to the history to see, well, why do people feel the way they do? So even though slavery was passed, but you entered the Jim Crow era, So but also the way the book's put together, because it has a lot of photos, it has text, it enables the reader to move through pretty
To
quickly.
take the journey.
And it gives you the highlights of these special events.
This is available on Amazon?
Yes, it's available in Amazon. It's also available through Barnes & Noble. Matter of fact, they had invited me to do a book signing there, so I've had 3 book signings at Barnes & Noble.
Wonderful.
I've had them at the public libraries and various places. But
Kay, it's a privilege to know you, and we're so glad that you came and shared your remarkable family and your remarkable story with us today. We could go on and on. Maybe we'll have you back.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. And thank you all, and tune in again for Hometown Histories.